At this point, you've simplified your algorithm to calculate the difference down to just 3 lines of code. That's good, but we can do even better. We can get it down to just 1 line of code. In this exercise, we'll finalize our revisions to the difference algorithm and put it together to calculate the score and display it to the user. Along the way, you'll learn about an important Swift concept, the difference between variables and constants. Let's dive in. Currently, we have added some code to convert a negative number to a positive number. Basically, no matter what, we want to make sure this is a positive number. Well, this is kind of a common thing that you need to do in your apps. So when there's a common thing that's math related, especially like this, it's a good idea to check the Swift standard library to see if there might be a helper function that can help you with this. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to Help Developer Documentation, and we're going to go to the Swift standard library, int. And let me click that here. Okay, so we can kind of scroll through here to see if there's any kind of handy methods on int that might help us. So we've already seen some of these, converting floating point values. We've seen creating random integers. Here's things to see if it's a multiple of another number, magnitude of a number. Oh, wait a minute. Here's one that says return the absolute value of a given number, abs. So if I click on that, you might have learned this from math class. Absolute value is a fancy way of saying if it's a positive number, return a positive number. If it's a negative number, multiply by a negative one. So this is basically exactly what we're doing right here. So this is exactly what we want. And the way it works is you just type in abs in parentheses, you put in whatever the value is and it returns the absolute value of that. So that is exactly what we want. So what we're going to do here is we're just put abs and in parentheses, put this, and then we can delete our other code here. All right, so like we've seen a couple other times in this course, we're getting a warning on this line, and this warning, if we click on it, says the variable difference was never mutated. Consider changing to a let constants, replace var with let. And now it's finally time to talk about why this warning is happening, and it leads me to an important discussion about let versus var. It turns out that Swift makes a distinction between variables and constants. As we discussed in the episode on variables, you can change the value of a variable at any time. However, once you set a constant, you can never change it again. If you try to change it, the Swift compiler will give you an error. The keyword var creates a variable, while let creates a constant. In the first versions of your algorithm, you declared the difference as a variable because that value could change depending on your if-else statement. But in the latest version, once you calculate the difference or the awarded points, they will never change again. So that could really be a let or a constant rather than a variable. Whenever you declare a value that will never change in Swift, it's better to make it a constant with let. That makes your intent clear, which in turn helps the Swift compiler understand your program better. A good rule of thumb is to prefer to use constants with let as much as possible and only use variables with var if you know you need to change the value later on. That way the Swift compiler can optimize your code as much as possible. That's why we've been saying all of these warnings in Xcode so far. It's because Xcode noticed that in some cases we've been using var to declare variables, but those variables never changed, so we could have used let, and it helpfully notified us about that. So let's go through our code and update all of those variables to constants, which should resolve all of our warnings and get Bullseye to a clean state. All right, so back in game.swift, we have this variable difference, which is never going to change once we set it to an initial value, so we can just change that to a constant instead of a variable since we don't need it to change. And we just repeat that for these other items that don't change. For awarded points, we can do the same. By the way, this is one of those cases where the error message from Xcode is actually really good, and it even includes a fix me button that I can click and it'll replace the var with let for me, which is really convenient sometimes. I'm going to go to content view because I believe we have a couple warnings there as well. Yes, on this line, here we're creating a rounded value. We set it to an initial value. We never changed it again. So that's an example of when we should have a let. And if we remember in Bullseye, we actually were creating a couple variables here that never changed. So we're going to change those from var to let as well. Okay, and then I'm going to click on this tab here, which shows all of our errors or warnings, and we don't see any. So I'm just going to make sure everything works. Command B to build, and Command U to run our unit test. Good practice to make sure we didn't break anything. And our unit tests all pass. So now we have our code following some best practices of using constants where possible rather than variables.